The second paper is on standard of living. There are two authors. I don't know who is speaking. Are you dividing 50-50? Okay. Professor Vecchi then.
Okay, thank you. This is an investigation on how the well-being, living standards of Italians have changed over 150 years, trying to compare Italy's experience with other countries. The key questions that we have tried to address are easily summarized. There has been in this paper a major effort for measuring living standards. Measuring things is a task that is not always appreciated, because as soon as you have measured something, people ask why it went that way. People are more interested in knowing the reasons for taking for granted that something has been measured, but this is not the case for many living standard indicators for this country. So we really made an effort to measure living standards, taking living standards as a multidimensional concept, which complicates the task tremendously. It's not just about money, consumption or income, but also many other dimensions, such as good health, education, child labor, and many others. And then we try to identify when and how improvements occur. There is a tendency in the literature to like long-run movements, explanation in identifying laws or regularities that can depict the long-run evolution. And we probably are more in favor of on a different approach in trying to learn about episodes, on focusing on turning points rather than unfolding and smooth movements over time. So we try to identify the timing, really, and to learn from it. And to the extent to which this is possible, we would like to ask questions like, was Italy a special case, or was it just doing on average? Was it surfing the international tide, or did Italians somehow, somewhen, made it better than others, or worse than others? So these are the two key questions that we tackled with this paper. As a natural starting point is the GDP, which is often taken as a measure of well-being per se, GDP per capita, of course. Then it's Alberto's presentation will save me a lot of time. By and large, over the 150 years since Italy's unification, GDP per capita has multiplied by a factor of 13, which is better than others, but worse also than others. It's not revealing too much about whether Italy is a special case or not, taken as a single number like this. If we make an effort to take into account that the structure of the population has changed dramatically over 150 years, we were young, there were many kids in 1861, now we are among the oldest population on Earth, and so needs and other economies of scale have been intervening during 150 years, so we might wish to adjust for this or to take into account for this demographic changes. If we do this and we, instead of divide by the count of the population, we transform into per adult equivalent, then we end up with an even rosier conclusion. If we consider the period 1881-2011, per capita GDP increased by 8, per adult equivalent GDP increased by 11. So somehow this is suggesting that if we account for the evolution in needs of a changing underlying structure in the population, that the improvement is even better when measured by the GDP. We should also consider that to produce this income, this GDP, the labor effort has decreased significantly over time, as it has been the case for other countries. In the next slide, I give you a sense of how large has been this increased consumption of leisure. Here on the vertical axis, we are measuring the hours worked per worker per year. So it was about 3,000 hours at the beginning, at the time of the unification. And then by putting on the same graph a number of different sources, we can see how and when this effort, labor effort, decreased over time for reaching levels that nowadays are about half what was 150 years ago. So this is it's also telling us that if we corrected for effort, if we valued the leisure, the increased consumption of leisure, we would have even a sort of larger improvement than GDP per capita suggests. So the bottom line here is that, of course, while we recognize that GDP is key, is a key driver for well-being, it does not provide a good sense about the time and the process through which well-being improved. So we cannot use GDP per capita as a well-being indicator to cure. This holds especially true when we consider long time horizons as we are doing here. Also, not only the effort has decreased because of shorter hours worked, but also because of changes in the labor force participation. So this gives you a sense of how kids have been classified economically active during the past 100 years, and is telling you that Italy has experienced a dramatic decrease in the incidence of child labor since the very beginning, since the first year for which data are available. At the time of unification, about 80% of kids were working, were economically active, and then even during phases where industrialization was most rapid, the country succeeded in sending kids to school instead of to factories or to keep them employed, which is something that is not common. The experience we have in other countries is significantly different. So this is suggesting also that in a way, the modern economic growth has been beneficial to a number of subjects in the population. Of course, as a welfare analyst, I'm very unhappy having only average values around. We care about the distribution of the benefits of an increased GDP, and so as soon as you try to go beyond the per capita figures, then what we meet is the variance. Variance means dispersion, means inequality. So the question here is whether this success in improving GDP per capita has been distributed in a more equal way. In other words, if Italy is growing equal or unequal. The problem is that it's very hard to estimate income inequality for years in which no modern probabilistic surveys were available. Survey data are available after World War II, and here we have to find a solution for the first 100 years in order to be able to estimate income inequality. And so the way I think we succeeded in estimating this was by using a novel data set, a novel method. The data set has been called Italian Household Budget Data Set and consists of about 20,000 households' budgets that have been gathered from all over the Italian territory for the first 100 years, the epoch during which there was no survey data. So the way we try to get the data that we need to estimate income distribution has been by collecting thousands and thousands of household budgets that are to be found in libraries, archives, and all sorts of places. And so just to give you a sense of the operation, in the next slide, I've summarized the process that allowed us to go from a collection, from a very large collection of household budget data to statistically, hopefully robust estimates of income inequality, right? So the first step was to get a lot of money, to get collaborators going all over the places to gather household budgets. So money matters. And we managed to collect about 20,000 income data at the household level. Then we organized these budgets into, between quotes, samples at 10 years interval, exactly the same date when population censuses were carried out. So we obtained as many samples. So one sample for 1861, another one for 10 years later, and another one for 1881 up to 1931. Then we used population weights in order to solve the problem of transforming a collection of household budgets into something that could be claimed representative of the population. So we used statistics, there is a very old technique which is called post-stratification. Knowing how many of each family type were actually in place in a population at a given time, we can construct weights or expansion factors that we associate to our household in the samples so that we can weight, we can put the right weight to each household. So no matter whether, we don't care too much whether the collection of households is not balanced, we put it in balance through the use of population weights that can be constructed in a very flexible way. Once we have weights, then we are done, because basically we associate households to weights and we carried out weighted estimation. That's a very simple idea. Given that we should not forget that we deal with 19th century data, we need to find some protection against data oddities. You know, if you look at empirical distribution of 19th century's data, you have holes, you have pikes, you have all kinds of things that affect inequality indices tremendously. We all know that inequality indices are extremely sensitive to contaminants, and so we would like to avoid to have our results driven by poor quality of the underlying data. The way we thought to get some protection against this fragility that affects inequality estimates is the use of a parametric function that I will show you in the next slide the way it works. But the idea is to, instead of using the empirical distribution in a non-parametric way, we fit a parametric, a 4-parameter parametric functional form so as to smooth all kinds of funny things that go in the data. And we estimated a very flexible functional form, which is called generalized beta of the second kind, who has been explored by Stephen Jenkins extensively and seems to work pretty well in this kind of investigation. Once we have estimated functional form, it's very easy to estimate inequality indices as a function of the parameters of the functional form. So in order to summarize this, the way we proceeded is summarized in this slide. We have a number of 10 years interval distribution. The histogram here shows you, this is for 1861, we have about 1,500 households, which is a decent number also by modern standards. So this is the empirical distribution. As you can see, this is something that should not be here. This is a data failure. It's not something that you find in modern data. We have lack of observation over here. Other circumstances we have too many. So the way we smooth these things out is by fitting a flexible parametric function like this. This is also the trick that makes us confident about the fact that after, at some point in our story, we have that the Bank of Italy, the National Statistical Institute, they carry out the first pilot surveys. The problem with those surveys is that we don't have the microdata, the data at the household level. What we are given is simply the tabular data. So we have tabulation. Tabulation means histograms. So histograms, they kill variance, of course, because they collapse, they aggregate information. So the way we smooth the fact that our sources, underlying sources, change their nature. They are granular pseudo-micro data set at the beginning. They become tabular data in between. And in the end, we have the high-quality data set because we have that eventually in 1977, we have thousands of households available as a micro data set. At that point, we think that the fact that the nature of the data changes over time is sort of controlled by imposing a functional form. So by so doing, as you can see, we end up with snapshots of the income distribution, and this allows us to unveil, to discover the distributional history of the country for the first time since its unification. And this is the outcome. And this graph here, we have the Gini index on the vertical axis over time. As you can see, for the first 70 years, inequality has fluctuated within a relatively narrow band, but at a high level, so to speak. A Gini of 50 is a very high temperature in the metric of inequality. This is the levels that you observe nowadays in Russia, in Brazil, in Mexico perhaps, in countries that rank highest in the inequality ranking, right? So then we have exploited a fantastic survey that Doxa carried out in 1948. This is a picture of the first sort of representation that we have of inequality for the modern times. And then we have, with these triangles here, inequalities as estimated on the basis of tabular data. As you can see, inequality drops dramatically in the 70s. And then we have a plateau down here during the 80s. And this story is well known, so I don't need to remind you. This is, there are plenty of paper here. And then we have this reversal here, which is what is worrying us and is keeping us concerned, given that we are failing to grow, inequality is on the rise, as you can guess, also poverty is likely to follow the same pattern. So this is, I will sort of summarize this evidence into 3 comments. There is, according to our estimates, unambiguous evidence that modern economic growth in Italy has been accompanied by a long-run reduction in inequality. This is not the case for the few countries for which we have evidence available. Jeffrey Williamson is here, and you can ask him questions because he was responsible for all the few countries for which we know something in terms of long-run changes, right? So in the case of Italy, we find no trace of the Kuznets curve, and we believe that after all, on a methodological ground, Atkinson 1997 was or is right. He emphasized that a better approach in investigating long-run changes is, rather than focusing on trends or those long-run regularities that economists like so much, he suggested, let's learn from episodes. Let's change the methodological approach, and let's try to understand why at some point, at some time in our story, we observe turning points or something like that, which is kind of different approach. Rather than searching for regularities, we search for trend reversals or episodes, which is something that I think our evidence implies. We have also tried to explore the extent to which the pattern observed in inequality affects our view of economic progress. And one way we can do this is by adjusting GDP.
There are 4 minutes left.
4 minutes, all right. Then I have to accelerate tremendously. So by adjusting GDP by inequality, we end up with a sort of, in a way, strong conclusion. Whilst GDP per capita increased by 13, a factor of 13 over 150 years, when we adjust GDP by using the Gini index or the Atkinson measure with the high inequality aversion parameter, then this highlights that Italy has been more successful than previously thought, because it has been able to grow relatively fast, but to distribute this progress in a very egalitarian way. So in a way, this is suggesting that Italy is it's an interesting state, quasi state. In 4 minutes, I will try to squeeze like 10 slides, which is almost impossible. Non-monetary dimensions of well-being. This is probably the single most brilliant performance of Italy, the conquest of longevity. This is the life expectancy at birth, and shows you that even at a time when GDP was not growing, was not catching up with other countries, in the metric of life expectancy, Italy was tremendously successful. We almost made it to catch up with France, which was a significantly richer country than Italy. We didn't do better than others during the interwar period, but notwithstanding 2 world wars, the worst crisis ever experienced, we still improved all social indicators. This is just one example. And then we have the great leap in the second post-war war, and we observed that we ended up second to Japan and higher than most other countries, even if richer. So we made adjustments, of course, in order to try to include this improvement in GDP. Once again, Jeffrey Williamson has provided a kindly method that simply confirms that if we take into account the improvement in longevity, then the pattern, the timing, our assessment of the timing changes in improvement of living standard changes considerably. Liberal Italy get out much better in terms of living standard than as described by GDP. Education is probably the gloomiest chapter in our story. In the end, we defeated illiteracy, of course, but it took us forever, basically. This is what is telling you this. There is no, Italy was even below Spain, right? It was overcome by Greece and Japan, by everyone. So this is something that I don't want to spend too much, given that it is Italy's birthday. Now, the big question here is the curse of multidimensionality. Given that well-being is defined by a vector, is by definition a n-dimensional vector, the question is, how do we summarize? Because in some dimensions we did very well, in others we lagged behind. So how to end of the game should we summarize this? So this is the question, the big question, and there is no happy ending here in the sense that I don't think we have an answer. This is to tell you the story in advance. One strategy is to sort of transform achievements in non-monetary dimension of well-being into monetary terms. This is what you have seen before, even in the space of a few seconds. So Tobin, Nordhaus, and many others have suggested, why don't we value 1 extra year of life, we include it in the GDP, and see how the stories change. This is one approach. I don't think I like it. The second one is to collapse the many dimension into a nice scalar measure. This is what composite indices do, or have, as they have been recently defined by Martin Revaglion, mash up indices. So the idea here is use the human development indicator, for instance, which is probably the most popular one. The other one is to recognize that multidimensionality will always be with us, and maybe to improve our skills in dealing with multidimensionality, and instead of collapsing, which to me is a synonym of killing information, the suggestion is, let us live along together with multidimensionality, let's have a dashboard of indicators, and let's get better in reading and interpreting this. So, Human Development Index, we have reconstructed the 150 years, and if we take in this graph, the red line is us, The other symbols here are previous estimates. There is no revolution in the changes here. It's a smoother path, which is telling us that if we use as a threshold for defining ourselves as a human developed country, then this is a relatively recent achievement. The threshold of 0.8 has been suggested to as the threshold for leaving the not so developed area, and if we believe this kind of thing, then the conclusion is that most of achievement is really recent. Other suggestions have been put forward because of the implicit trade-offs that are built in these composite indices. Many improved different formula have been suggested. The one suggested by Leandro Prados de la Escosura has been tested here, and the story here is telling you that in the end, Italy is converging, but emphasis is really in the end. What is striking here is the parallelism. The trajectory, the red trajectory here, is remarkably parallel to the average of OECD countries for more than a century. So I mean, the bottom line here is that, yes, there is convergence, but has been really, really recent by historical terms. If I have one more minute for concluding, then the dashboard approach, this is just one element of the dashboard here. Here we are comparing GDP on the horizontal axis with life expectancy. Both measures, of course, have been normalized so as to range between 0 and 1. If you observe perfect positive correlation, that you should observe that the line here should move along the diagonal over here. The farther away is the trajectory, the highest is the evidence that the two dimensions of the monetary dimension and the non-monetary dimension are not strictly correlated. And what you see here is that during the first, if you look at this point here, 1951, this is telling you that in 1951, after about 100 years of Italy, since Italy unification, the progress in terms of GDP per capita was about 10%. In contrast, almost 70% of the gains in life expectancy was achieved. So this is telling you that as far as the timing is concerned, GDP per capita is a very bad idea if you want to get a sense of how living standards have improved, right? The gloomiest chapter is clearly visible here. Here we have education, gross enrollment rate. In the early stages, primary education was improved irrespective of GDP. This is the way you interpret this steep curve here. GDP is strictly positive correlated with secondary, but when it comes to tertiary education, you can see that no matter how rich you get, there is no way you can bring Italians to attend universities. This is a clearly nice way of summarizing successes and failures of GDP in capturing improvements or changes in other dimensions. I don't think I have time to go through the first of the two slides I have about conclusions. I would like to emphasize that when dealing with periods where, as is the case for Italy, where you have democracies at some point disappears, all our efforts fails to account for this other factor, which is missing the picture that you will find in the paper. So we plan to deal with this before the paper is transformed into a chapter. But of course, it's a very difficult task to value the changes in political freedom and civil rights that Italy experienced over 150 years, but should be somehow in the picture. I would also like to emphasize that if any period has to be defined as a miracle period, this is the 70s as far as living standards are concerned, and is not the 50s and the 60s as the GDP-based story goes. So there is a delay in the way we would label the period as miraculous or not. There is this reversal in the 90s about which we heard yesterday from the governor. And finally, even if we had to ignore the issue, but other studies are telling us that the territorial divide, the north-south divide, has been very large, very often on the rise, and extraordinarily persistent. So even if it's not in the paper, we should ask ourselves how to interpret our results, knowing that the questione meridionale, the north-south gap, was there at the time of the unification, and this is really hard to value, to assess. Aware that we have described things and we have not provided answer to the question why it went like this, we would sort of welcome any suggestion on how to investigate the next question that concern mechanisms, causality issues, and so forth. Thank you very much for your attention.
I understand that well-being is always a matter of discussion and of gives problems. So I understand that he has taken some more time. I hope that the discussant is not so involved as Becky, otherwise we go out of time. Please.
Well, let me be brief. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I think I learned a lot. And I think there are really many important strands of research which are which could basically start from this paper. So I took my job as a discussant of this paper not so much to go into the methodological details, because I think they did a beautiful job in putting together all these different data sources and using the household budgets, which is a completely novel approach. But in trying to tie together some of the issues which were raised, and some of these were raised yesterday actually, so I think this could provide a little bit of a link between yesterday's panel discussion and today's presentation. So let me just go through 2 or 3 key points, what I think are the key points. First of all, the issue that well-being is multidimensional, and I think the paper provides very convincing evidence that this is an important issue. Now, economists typically would like to measure welfare, I would dare to say utility, but have to account for different dimensions, and I will go back to this point as I go along. There are some economists who would argue that, after all, income, let's say GDP, is the basic measure that gives you access to resources and command over resources, and so we have to somehow match up what we see in the data, this discrepancy between some sort of well-being, which is longevity, health, and another part of the story, which is the income, the resource command. So there is something which is not matching. Where is the missing part? And I think I will give some intuition of that. Then the paper gives a lot of nice evidence, and I was expecting no less, given the names of the authors, on inequalities, health inequalities, and human development. So I will not go through the paper again, because this was presented so nicely. There is nothing to say more. So the questions which are raised, and I will add more questions, are: was it a smooth, long-run, inescapable trend, or was it a sequence of episodes? And I think it is convincing that it was a sequence of episodes, and I will try to provide an interpretation for that. But before that, I would like to start with a puzzle. The puzzle is, does 8061 represent a break in the various long-term measures of well-being, or a starting point? And I think this is an important question. Unfortunately, I'm not the best person to answer this question, but in the room there are many distinguished people who did work on it. But I think this is one of the puzzles which still need to be discussed. And then how do we explain these differences in the different measures of well-being? So that's the storyline, if you like, of my presentation. So the first line of interpretation is, where are the missing links? Which, for example, go from economic resources to the health stock or longevity, and then back from the health stock or longevity to income. And this was somehow raised yesterday by Ignazio Visco when he said, is there some endogenous link between these variables, or are they exogenously going each on its own way? So is longevity something which comes from the weather, the sun, or is it something to do with GDP as well? The second line of interpretation is, what is hiding behind some of these aggregate trends? And I would like to point to the role of the welfare state and institutions and ask the questions, do policies matter? Because after all, that's what we would, as economists, would like to learn from the past, whether some policies did have an impact or not on well-being. So here I have to apologize that, because I wanted to have a very long series, I had to take the Madison and Malanema series, so I really apologize to the authors. It's not because I wanted to ignore their work today, but this was, the best I could do. I actually tried to match the two series, so I thought, please forgive me if I did a bad job. But I see here, the two lines should represent the two structural breaks in this series. And whereas I see a huge structural break, if I talk in econometric terms, in 1945, maybe one in World War I do not see a structural break in 1861 as far as GDP is concerned. So the first temptation from this very casual inspection of the data, very sort of no econometrics behind, is when is it that we could say the Malthus law was broken? And today I didn't have time to bring up some nice new stories going about the relationship between the population growth and economic growth, but maybe this is one of the issues that we should start looking at in more detail again. So going back to these issues maybe. So is it only after these major shocks, such like this World War II, that capital technology became the leading, the driving force of growth? So this is one strand, I think, of discussion which I cannot take up now, but maybe the authors could somehow address. So now there is an answer, if you want, to some of these questions that are posed. So if we buy the author's interpretation that it is more episodes that we should look at, so what about longevity then? Is this also, should we look at longevity also like in episodes? And I really like these pictures. I'm sorry that I had to take them from the paper, so they're not very clear, but this is one of the last that it was shown by Professor Vecchi. And this is looking at education. And on the x-axis you have GDP per capita, and on the y-axis school enrollment. And as it was said before by Giovanni, the first few years you have this very steep growth in enrollment into the basic elementary school. Then one thing that I didn't know, I must confess, and I discovered recently working on this paper, is that it is in the Constitution in 1948 that kids should have 8 years compulsory education, but then it was a different issue to implement this, and the implementation didn't come about until 1963. So what I did in this picture was to try and look at policies on top of these pictures that were given to us. So let me, for example, remind you that 1963 was a time where also there was unification of different levels of secondary school, and finally in 1969 what I call free access to university, meaning that from different fields you could go into the university, you didn't have to do lyceum as an access route. So, you know, whereas you can, it's very hard to link the early days to these policy reforms, I see that the whole of the secondary education and even university take-up proportions are largely explained by these changes in policies. And as Giovanni correctly pointed out, unfortunately, this is not the area where we fare too well, but still, this gives us some hope that maybe things will improve if we put sort of our efforts into improving the education system. So that's one line of analysis. Also, I wanted to back up some of the facts that the authors found on a different data set that I'm working on, but the authors know very well. It's the shared data, and the advantage of this data, although it doesn't stretch very long, is that we can compare people of different European countries because they answer exactly the same question. So we have exactly a comparison which is identical across countries. And this a picture looks at retrospective questions about completed years of education. So on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have different cohorts, people born 1920, 1924, Italy versus West Germany. Okay? So what do you see? You see the gray bit, which is the no education bit. Then you say that you see the blue 0-5 years, and you say the light gray, which is the 14+ years, let's say university, okay? And you see exactly the same picture as the authors produced. Italy goes from a period where you have basically only the 0-5 years education to a much more diversified situation where you have also a lot of people going into secondary education and eventually also some younger cohorts having some university.
May I remind 4 minutes?
Yeah, I will go fast. So this, just to say that, you know, what we see in the data set which was produced is born by other facts that we see in the data, in alternative data sources. But one thing I want to show you, which I think is very nice, is in this data set that I just mentioned, which is called SHARE, you also ask people, how many books did you have in your home when you were age 10? And this gives us like the endowments, how these people may have been growing in a household where there was already a lot of welfare, a lot of... So what you see here, Germany has a wide gap between years of education and books in the house, age 10, meaning that education adds a lot to the existing human capital. Whereas Italy, basically the orange lines are very close. So, you know, education, in a sense, correlates very strongly with your parents being educated, something we know, but this is confirming what... and it's only recently, you see, people born after 1940, 1950, that this is widening. So that's the good news, if you like. You know, we're, across generations, we are sort of improving now education levels. Okay, maybe one way to address the issue, which the author hinted to, but maybe we could do more, would be to look at a life cycle concept of welfare And I think the best shot here is when the authors produced this picture, which was not shown, with per equivalent adult GDP. And, you know, this is really interesting because it really tells you something about the welfare of consumers going up from 1950 onward. Leisure is the other, if you like, variable in the utility function. This is also going up over time, so this is good. But is it good for the future? This is early retirement percentages of people in age, say, 50, 54, or 59, 55, 59, which is the green line. And I don't think this is so good for the future. I mean, maybe we should reduce leisure a little bit and maybe have people working more, but this is one of my sort of research projects, which I don't want to go into it. Another important reform that we should mention is the national health system, 1978. Before that, there were sort of segmented health insurance schemes. And this, I think, marks a line in the longevity improvement, but more, if you like, in the years of good living standard, which is one of the measures that we would like to have systematically. However, it is true that the survival growth is spectacular, as the author said. But again, I would like to go behind the scene and show you, for example, mortality rates over time by region and age groups. Now here, this is conditional survival. It's not survival at birth, it's survival age 50, starting from age 50. And you see the difference between the north, which is the black line, the center and the south, okay? So even in terms, we know this about GDP, but even in terms of survival, there is some north-south difference, which is worth investigating. Why do we have these differences? So let me go to the last bit of the explanation. And once again, can we do this exercise of finding the driver of reduction in inequality? And this is the picture which was shown by Vecchi before, with inequality going down dramatically from 1970, okay? And you see it very clearly between the last two red bars. Now, I would say that if there is one explanation for this, is pensions. Pensions between, or welfare, if you like, by and large. In 1969, pensions became earnings related, so they became much more generous than previously. They were extended to survivors, so this was basically meant widows, essentially. So we really have a close link there between policies and results in terms of inequality decreasing. Obviously, 1992, 1990 reforms go in the other direction, and that shows a little bit also in the data, but I wouldn't impute the reversal in the inequality index to pension reforms. Conclusion. So let me draw my conclusion. I think this is the picture I wanted to show you. This is my own work, which I've done thanks to the help of Andrea and Giovanni, who gave me the data somehow. But GDP growth rate is the green line. And you see, you know, by and large, it's not impressive. This GDP is bouncing up and down, but it's not impressive. There are huge swings in the 50s, 60s, and then it goes back. We know this. The other growth rate, which is very important, is the survival rate, and this is a different axis. You have to look at the axis on the right, and this is survival out of 100,000 people, so it's not in percentage terms, okay? And you see this spectacular increase that we were discussing. Now, what's in the middle? In the middle is debt growth rate. So I think that's the explanation, how you match these improvements in some of the dimension of well-being and the fact that GDP did not, after all, grow so dramatically. There must be something in between. So the question now is the outlook for the future. Yes, 1 second. Again, drawing from this shared data, I want to show you the percentage of respondents who say that they are in financial hardship over time, starting from 1940. And you see Germany on the bottom panel has clearly a crisis around the 1980s, which is picked up by the data because people say that they are in financial hardship. But Italy has a slow increasing trend in financial hardship, which I think is very concerning. So this means that people feel that they don't meet their needs. They don't make it to the end of the month, essentially. And the other, I think, concerning issue, which was mentioned yesterday by Livi Bacci, is the longevity improvement. Can we keep on improving longevity as we did? Well, this is the predicted subjective survival probability versus the body mass index. Body mass index, as you know, is a sort of a measure of height and weight combined, okay? And if it is too large, above 25, 30, then you go into obesity. If it is too small, then you are too skinny, okay? And typically, developing countries have the problem of skinny people. So you have body mass indexes around 15, 20. Well, you see that Italy is moving into the obesity side because now the survival probability is declining very, very steeply with the body mass index, which is recorded in the data. So the overlook for the future, I think, is first, is it sustainable? A welfare state which provides you with health, social security, and the like, and so keeps up the standard of living despite a low GDP growth. Second, can we hope that these improvements in longevity and health will keep on going as they did in the past, or maybe we should be a little bit more careful about what it will be for the next 10 or 20 years? Thank you.
I was asking myself if I should be worrying about my body mass. But in any case, let's go on. Any question?
Thanks. As usual, I enjoyed a paper written by... I'm not that virile, I'm sorry. I've lost body mass, that's a problem. I have two comments. One is, in page 15 and in figure 12, I think you point to a usually neglected measure of inequality, which is what people call the gender penalty. And in the late 19th century in Italy, you find no difference in life expectancy between men and women. And from a biological point of view, you would expect that women live longer. At this time, probably for the health levels, 3 years more. So, and this is something that Nick Kraft also found for Britain before the Industrial Revolution, or Massimo Livi Bacci found for 18th century Spain, is that women lived less than men, even though their potential to live was longer than for men. And this, in my view, would be an interesting measure of inequality, gender inequality. So I think this is, and since you provide the evidence, I think this is something to develop. The other issue is figure 19, your time patterns. Here you have that tends, this one over here, life expectancy tends to get flatter as GDP per capita goes up. But I think to some extent, this is the result of the fact that GDP per head grows and grows, and life expectancy is bounded, has a biological, is asymptotically bounded, because you don't live more than 85 years. The same way you cannot have more than 100% enrollment in education or 100% literacy. So unless you do some sort of transformation in order to capture the fact that it's much more difficult to increase life expectancy as your life expectancy starting level is higher, and also the quality of your life is much higher if you live longer. Unless you do some sort of adjustment, you're going to have this kind of flat trend.
Any other question?
Thank you. So this is pretty impressive work, but it's well, necessarily incomplete. You have highlighted in a way, indirectly, that all these indicators of material well-being, well, we tend to forget that there is also, of course, an immaterial side to this. For example, if you stress that there seems to be something like a preference for leisure, right? People are not working as much as they could. So how do these indicators compare to things like happiness, or to look at the opposite, the incidence of suicide or depression? Did you look into that? And do you have an idea maybe how these indicators also develop over time?
Thank you. Okay, then we have. I just one question, at least. I wonder that we are in the Bank of Italy, so we don't discuss political issues. But I've seen at least, I have looked after your paper, and I've seen at least around 10 political issues that is in your paper. So I guess that the problem of freedom and the measure of freedom is just one of them, but there are a lot of them in your paper. The most common is the 70, what is happening during the 70s, that surely was a big political issues, and the struggle between workers and padronato, let's say, no? As we was talking there. And the second point is that I found it extremely funny, is that at certain moments it seems that we need a war to get out and to start to have a deep increase in GDP or in our welfare, which is also a strong political issue. At least a long time ago it was discussing this issue. And the third point is that perhaps a should be interesting to have a revival of psilocybin class analysis that he made during the 60s, and that was I think a piece of research in this subject really very interesting. Well.
How do I choose who to answer? Why don't you start? No, I just have a couple of comments on if we do, I mean, a straightforward answer to the last question, do we need a war to see a jump or an improvement in welfare? The answer is definitely not. We don't need it. It's sort of common to see booms after wars for many reasons that have been explained by economic historians. There is a backlog of technological innovations that are ready to be used, and there is a mismatch in demand. There are many reasons that are written in text, so we don't need a war, of course, to see that. I have just a comment on the very interesting overlapping of political innovation that we have seen from Aga's discussion, that I think it was a very good idea in order to figure out what are the candidate sort of policies that should be considered, at least to explain the patterns highlighted in the data. I think that the 1978 major health reform is certainly a very important issue, but I also think that it's sort of late with respect to what we observe in the data. And a better candidate might be the 1968 Riforma Ospedaliera, when for the first time hospitals were really brought and were scattered throughout the country, reaching the rural areas. I think that might have been a key determinant for the amazing acceleration that we see in life expectancy, because that is where the poorest people is reached, and so the largest gains have to be expected if you manage to achieve the rural or the way the 1968 reform did it. So I think it was a great input to have this exercise in overlapping policies and interventions to our graphs and see what are the candidates. And I leave the floor to Andrea, who might wish to comment on. Right.
Infant survival.
Yes, the major improvement is due to the fall in the infant mortality rate, which is responsible for the largest gain in life expectancy at birth, as an algebraic sort of fact. And that was due to the reduction in infective diseases, that are the ones that are easiest and cheapest to defeat, because it's a matter of spreading knowledge to understand a little bit how the contagious take place, and so it's relatively cheap. It's very interesting, Leandro's suggestion on the gender gap, and I think I agree with your suggestion. It might be an interesting measure of inequality in a way. However, let me just remind those who are not familiar with Italian historical statistics that estimates of life expectancy, those sort of produced by ISTAT, by serious epidemiologists, date back to 1872. So what we did here was an attempt within our efforts to go back to 1861. But before I really believe to the difference that we see, I would like to wait for more expert sort of specialists to validate our estimates. So those 10 years at the beginning, I think that this is a problem, also is a general problem. Statistics for Italy during the first decade, they looks like other time period, but they're, in my opinion, more uncertain. And this uncertainty is not something that is written. It's something that experts know about. They don't comment on this because they know that what they observe at the face value might not be true. So I think we have a problem that is more general regarding to the first decade of historical estimates.
Well, we don't have much time, so let me add only probably a couple of things. All the suggestions are very important, very interesting. This was a paper about describing facts. So we didn't have time, and it was not even our major core questions to explain those facts. So this is left for future work. And of course, the next step is to bring into the story institutions, the point that Agard made very well. The issue about happiness, it is in our agenda, collecting data about happiness, but of course you cannot go very far back. We have data for the second post-war period. And of course you can have suicide and other indicators, but we may collect many other indicators. But my co-authors worked like a slave for 3 years collecting this data, almost jeopardizing his marriage, and so I don't want to exploit him any longer. So we can stop with these indicators, I think, except for political indicators. Let me just spend just a minute on one important point that is somewhat neglected in the kind of discussion we had, and also Giovanni was rather quick in going through the charts. That is the chart shown now, and that is also an explanation for the questions that was raised before. This chart depicts the connection, the link between GDP per capita and life expectancy, but it is important to understand what it is represented here. We take the absolute difference between the end of the period, so 2010, and the very first information, usually 1861. That is the case here. So that is the change, the increase, the absolute increase in GDP per capita or life expectancy. And then we take the proportion of this overall achievement over 150 years that was achieved in sub-periods. So actually this picture has no problem of maximum limit for life expectancy because it is just the gain from beginning to the end. And so we want to see here what is the timing of the achievements in different dimensions. And that is a very revealing picture because it tells you that life expectancy, the gain in life expectancy, 70% of it was in the first 100 years, and then improvement was much less. Whereas for the income, something different happened. And for income, that is a very interesting perspective. All the comments, the presentation by Bafigi before, and all the presentation yesterday, looked at the growth rate. So essentially look at increased percentage increases from one year to the next or over a long period. Here we look at absolute changes in this picture. So that means that we look at how much income is added during a period. And if you look from this perspective, and that is the perspective that matters most for well-being analysis, how many euros you have to buy goods and services and commodities. And if you look at well-being from this perspective, you see that the increase in well-being from in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is more or less comparable. You have a very different picture. You have a slowdown of the growth rate. But that doesn't mean that the absolute amount of things that you produce and you can consume falls as the growth rate. That is very important. When we talk about well-being, we talk about the things that people can consume and enjoy. And in absolute amount, the increase is the same, more or less the same, in all the decades since 61. This is a very different perspective from the one you see, you get if you look at the growth rate. And of course, the last year are years of great worries because we have a substantial decline in income that is not only proportional, but also in absolute terms. I think this is an issue that is, should interest us in these discussions. Should we be concerned only with relative increases or relative changes, or should we take more into account absolute changes in income and other dimensions.
Thank you. You are a little bit late, but...
I have to tell you that I raised my flag, but you didn't see me.
Oh, you. Sorry.
Sorry. The question is this. The measurement of welfare depends on a set of the value judgment, which change over time.
Yes.
You mentioned, for instance, freedom. Are we sure that the majority of our fellow Italians in the 30s were completely dissatisfied with the fascist regime, were completely dissatisfied with colonialism, would appreciate multiculturalism, and things that nowadays are quite common? So the problem is, should we aim to measure welfare through value judgment which are more or less constant, longevity, etc. Or we should measure also with those transient value judgment which are accepted by some generation as refused by others. In that case, the value of the welfare would change quite a lot.
Sure. But this happens also with GDP at constant price.
Sorry?
This happens also with GDP and constant price.
But that's the problem of the constant prices is just a gimmick for economists to go through time.
That's right.
Let me give just one very, very short answer to this question. The point is that
if we lose our coffee,
well, just very short. The point is that when you move to multidimensionality, you have multiple indicators, and the point is how to weight this indicator. So what the Human Development Index does is to put some weight on life expectancy, some weight on income, and some weight on education. The point is that those weights are not a mechanical exercise. Those weights are a judgment exercise, and that is the great lessons of Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen tells you that you cannot compare people. I cannot compare my utility with your own because we judge our own utility. So when we do interpersonal comparisons of well-being, we must make explicit our judgment values. And that is the only way that we confront and we compare our value judgments when we do the exercise.
Okay. May I ask you to reduce our coffee time so that we can start at 5 o'clock? Thank you.